Hey guys, this is Laura over at Four Paws Furniture Restoration. I'm getting ready to get started working on this dresser. I think I decided on putting some legs on there instead of doing a full base. So I'm going to start with taking all the drawers out and flipping the dresser over to see what I need to purchase to help brace the new legs up. So we're going to get started on it.
So it looks like I should be able to just cut the old base off and add some new boards on the ends to act as braces to screw the new legs into. So off to Lowe's we went. Lots of different types of wood to choose from. And then I also went ahead and picked out the paint while we were there. I'm going to be using the Valspar furniture or cabinet and furniture paint.
Okay guys, we're back from Lowe's. I went ahead and got the dresser completely flipped over. We're going to go ahead and vacuum up all the little cobwebs and dust bunnies from underneath it. And then we're going to start taking off the front part so we can trim it down. And then we're going to cut off the side pieces. And then we're going to start putting in the new braces for the legs to hold on to. Let's get started.
Using my shop vac makes it really quick and easy to get all the cobwebs off the bottom. So I was hoping that I would just be able to unscrew the base and take it apart so that I could just cut it off easily. But unfortunately I found out that the front board went all the way up attached to the side boards and would not come off so easily. So I removed what I could and then I taped off the rest of it so that it would help prevent splintering when I cut through it with my saw. To make it a little bit easier to cut the straight line, I went ahead and flipped the dresser up on its side and got on a ladder to be able to cut the sides off, and then flipped it back down whenever I was going to cut the front piece. I had to use my drill to make a little hole to be able to get my saw blade in before I started cutting straight across the front side of it. My saw struggled a little on those side pieces. I found a little chip in the veneer, so I went ahead and used some wood glue to glue it back down and then just taped it into place until the glue dried. Then I used my DeWalt orbital sander to just sand off the rough edges and tried to smooth out where I didn't quite get a perfectly straight line. Thankfully, the little trim piece that I took off on the front screwed right back over the edge that I cut so that you really couldn't tell that it wasn't perfectly straight. I decided just to use some 2x4s to screw into the bottom of the dresser to brace where the legs were going to be screwing into. Then I used my miter saw to cut the pieces to the right lengths. I just recently got this miter saw and it makes it so much easier than using a handsaw to cut these little boards. I used my drill to drill some pilot holes through the 2x4s before I put the screws in because I knew the screws would end up splitting the 2x4s when I put them in. I also used some wood glue before I screwed the boards in just for a little bit of extra strength. Using the 2x4s on the sides like this also helps to strengthen the frame of the dresser as well. I messed up when cutting the side pieces and took a little chunk out where I didn't mean to. So I mixed up some Bondo just so I could go ahead and fill that little crack in and then sanded it down. I really like this Bondo product because it dries up really hard, really fast, and it sands off really smooth and in a powder like dust. Then I flipped the dresser back over and started cleaning. I started out by just vacuuming out the inside of the drawers with my vacuum. You always want to remember to clean out the inside of the drawers because they are always pretty dusty and dirty, and sometimes you can find some surprises like some leftover socks.
Okay guys, got the base all cut off and it stood back up. We're gonna go ahead and do some deep cleaning on it. I already got the inside all vacuumed out and the drawers are out obviously. I'm gonna go ahead and start spraying it down with some Simple Green. This is just the lemon kind. I'm gonna use some shop towels and a little bit of a scrub brush to go through these little cracks on the top of the dresser. And then we're gonna start doing some scuff sanding and some primer.
It's always good to use a good degreasing cleaner when you're cleaning off the dresser because you don't want to be sanding and grinding down all the oils and dirt that's on top of the dresser to start with. Doing a good deep clean really helps with the adhesion of your paint. Having all the oils gone just helps the paint to adhere to the surface better. Plus, since I'm selling these pieces, I don't want to be sending somebody else's dirt home with people. This is also a good time to do a good once-over over the piece to make sure you can make a mental note of all the scratches and dents and dings or anything that's broken that you're going to have to repair. This dresser didn't have any existing hardware to have to remove, but it is important to remove the hardware before you do the cleaning because a lot of dirt and grime actually gets stuck behind the handles. And since I was planning on painting this piece, I just had to do a good scuff sand on it just to go ahead and make sure I got all the fine scratches off the top of it so I'd have a smooth finish, but also to roughen up the glossy finish that was there so that it would give a little bit of texture for my paint to actually adhere to. I was using a 120 grit sandpaper, which was probably a little bit rough for just a scuff sand, but there were some deep gouges on the top that I wanted to go ahead and get smoothed out while I was working on this. I used just a dry microfiber cloth to go ahead and wipe off the little bit of dust that was left over after I used my leaf blower to blow off the big stuff before I put the drawers back in to go ahead and get started with priming. Priming is an important step that you really don't want to skip for many reasons. One, it helps your paint adhere to the surface better. It also helps give you a good smooth texture over the surface because between sanding through the finish and if you have to putty or fill in any spots, it just helps to make everything a little more uniform. Priming also helps to highlight any scratches or dings that you need to have filled in or corrected before you start with paint. As you can see, I went through the finish completely in a lot of spots, especially on the top. So the priming also helps to prevent the wood tannins from bleeding through the surface. So I decided the seams around the edges didn't really fit the style that I was trying to create with this dresser. So I mixed up some Bondo and filled in those cracks just to try to give it a more smooth, sleek appearance. Because the Bondo dries so fast and I was doing such a large area, I had to do it in stages and just mix up small amounts at a time and fill it in and mix up more as I went. There's also a few little chips on the fronts of the drawers that I went ahead and used the Bondo to fill in. Then I went and used my orbital sander to go ahead and sand down the Bondo once it was dry. I figured I was probably going to have to do a second coat just to try to make it as smooth as possible. I really like the Bondo because it dries really hard, but it also takes a minute to get it sanded back down. And then I was seeing where I was having to sand all the way back down to the wood in some spots to try to make it as even as possible. I may have just been over sanding and wasting some of my time, but I was just trying to make sure that it was a smooth surface. I used my mouse detail sander to do the drawer faces just because it just helped get around the edges at the handle of the drawer a little smoother. Then I decided to switch to my Bondo spot glaze putty to get into the fine lines of where I had filled in the trim around the side, but then I also decided I didn't like all the wood grain that was showing through, so I just started puttying like crazy and may have went a little overboard. At this point, I was kind of regretting my decision to fill in that seam around the edges because it was being a pain to actually cover completely up. I kept failing and kept having to go back over it with more putty and resanding it back down. But thankfully, this spot glaze putty sands down pretty easily, so it wasn't that bad, but I was regretting my decision a little bit. But in the end, I think I did a pretty good job at getting all of the wood grain filled in, or at least most of it, and the seam filled in pretty good. So I went ahead and added another coat of primer just to make sure that there would be no bleed through from the putty, or there were still a few places that I sanded back down to wood. And I just wanted to make sure that was thoroughly covered so that it wouldn't pop up through my paint. And after I got done with that second coat of primer, I went ahead and got some 400 grit sandpaper and went ahead and did a quick sand over top of the surface before I started back with some paint. Since I was using such a dark navy color, it probably would have been smart if I would have used one of the gray primers instead of this bright white. But I didn't have it on hand, and I was just going to use what I had. I really like how this dark navy color is turning out. Because I spray with my drawers in, I have to take them out afterwards and go ahead and hand paint around the edges to fill in where the sprayer doesn't get. I like to use my Zebra Artist brush for these because they really help to get around the edges easily. And they do give a nice smooth finish afterwards. I probably need to try taping off the drawers and just spraying them and see if it goes a little bit faster, because this is kind of a tedious process, especially when you have so many drawers. And then after the paint was dry, I did another quick sand with some 400 grit sand pad just to help smooth out any texture that was left behind from the paint sprayer. Then I started with my second coat of paint just to get a complete full coverage, because majority of the time you can't get full coverage with just one coat. I always try to go in the same direction when spraying, especially on the last coat, and I always try to overlap by 50% just so that I get the same sheen throughout the whole dresser. Then I had my dad come over and help me flip the dresser over on its side so that I could put the legs on, just because at this point I didn't want to accidentally drop it and scratch up the fresh paint. So I measured out where I wanted my legs to go, and then I used my drill to drill the holes for the brad nuts to go in and got those screwed into place, and then I screwed my legs in. I like to use drawer paper on most of my projects just because it adds an extra little pop of color, and I also just think it gives a more high-end appearance when the drawers are finished off like that. I like to use the peel and stick wallpaper because it's pretty cheap and easy to apply. The drawers were quite dry and looked pretty old, so I went ahead and used some Howard's Feed and Wax to go ahead and restore a little bit of life to them and give them a little bit of a shine. I also used it on the drawer slides because my drawers were sticking a little bit, and it really helps to make them glide in and out a little smoother. Before I put the drawers back in, I went ahead and started with the top coat. I just used my zebra brushes to go ahead and paint around where the drawers would go and on the edges of the drawers. I'm using a water-based polyurethane with a satin sheen. Before I put the drawers back in, I went ahead and got out my hardware jig so that I could go ahead and pre-drill the holes for the hardware before I put the top coat on. Just in case I messed up, it would make it easier for me to putty and paint whatever I need to fix. I like using the hardware jig just because it helps to make sure your hardware is spaced properly, but you don't necessarily have to use it. Especially with these dark colors, I like to go ahead and put a little bit of my paint in my clear coat so that it helps avoid any cloudiness. I also decided I didn't like the color of the legs, so I went ahead and sanded down the pre-made finish that was on there and stained them the color that I wanted. In between my layers of top coat, I made sure to sand down with a 40 grit or 400 grit sandpaper just to make sure I smoothed out any texture that was left behind or by any fuzzes or hairs that landed in the top coat while it was drying. I decided just to be easy with my legs and just used a wax top coat on the legs just to give them a little bit of protection. I had a little bit of black wax on my brush, but I was using clear wax. It just gave a little bit of extra depth and color, right? After applying the wax, I just used a shop towel to wipe off any excess and polish it up so it'd have a little bit of a shine to it. After the last coat of top coat was dry, I went ahead and pulled out the drawers and added on the new hardware. Here's a quick look back at the orangey, outdated old dresser that we started with. And now the final product. This dresser has came such a long way. I'm so glad I decided to put the legs on it. The height makes a big difference and it really modernizes the dresser. I love this dark blue color that I picked, and the champagne bronze hardware is perfect with it. I'm definitely happy with how this project has turned out, and it might be one of my favorite ones I've done so far. Thanks for following along. I hope you guys enjoyed the process. If you do, please like and subscribe. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye, guys.